all to today's Zoom session entitled The Congarees, an 18th Century Crossroads, 1 Square Mile of History. I'm John Jameson, Heritage Consultant with the 12,000 Year History Park in Cayce, and I will host and moderate this session. The 12,000 Year History Park is a little under 400 acres of area in the southern part of the Timberland Trail within the city of Cayce in Lexington County. The park is rich in natural and historic resources. The historic Cherokee Path and the Old State Road both run through the park. Among notable historic sites are the remains of an 18th century fort and trading post, and the site of an 1865 Civil War battle that occurred just prior to the burning of Columbia. The main landscape feature of the battlefield is the over a mile-long stretch of pristinely preserved defensive earthworks that were constructed along the north bank of Congaree Creek. Today, we'll be talking about what in history is referred to as the Congarees, an 18th century crossroads and activity center with important commercial, residential, and military activities taking place there, all within a 1 square mile area in present-day Cayce. The area was a center of activities that laid the groundwork for early trade and settlement of the Midlands and beyond. Yet the history of this area is less understood and perhaps less appreciated than others in the state regarding the colonial Revolutionary War and later period significance. Today we will learn about how Cayce's Historical Museum's main building is a replica of the frontier trading post built in the area in 1665 or 1765, and how it was seized by the British during the Revolutionary War and used as a fort named Fort Granby, and later was the home for the Cayce family. We learn how the historical structures of the Lexington County Museum provide a backdrop for these stories of frontier life in 18th century. There are many factual and intriguing stories, including an Irish trader and his Catawba wife, that is, an Irish Indian trader and his Catawba wife, a young George Washington saved by men from the Congarees, a fort site that would become the training ground for the French and Indian War and later during the American Revolution, a religious cult that would threaten the new settlement and would bring forward an American Revolutionary War heroine, and floods and diseases that would mean a change for the early settlement and lead to the founding of Columbia. These and other stories will be told by today's guest speakers, David Brinkman, Andy Thomas, and J.R. Fennell. So now let's begin our virtual historical journey to the Congarees and the historic activities that happened there within just a 1 square mile area in the city of Cayce, in present-day Cayce. David Brinkman will be leading our discussion. Before you start, David, let you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself. Go ahead.
Well, John, yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm actually an engineer by profession, but back in the 90s, shortly after my dad passed away, I got involved with his World War II reunion group and became the historian for that group and actually another World War II group. So that's what really got me into the history part of it. And then some unusual, I call them miraculous things, led to me purchasing a property on the Broad River where we discovered a bridge abutment in the backyard. And that really pulled me into the local history, and one thing led to another. And eventually purchasing another property down in the area of the 12,000 Year History Park where we would find evidence of Granby and Fort Congaree too. So, and we continue to do that. We've been doing archaeology now for 8 years in the Riverland Park neighborhood and have discovered over 18,000 artifacts from these periods. So I'll be talking about that, actually presenting a lot of the evidence, and Andy and JR are going to step in at moments, when they have the, feel like there's an opportunity to fill in some history gaps there. And I think that's about it for an intro, and I'm ready to go. I can share my screen when you're ready, John.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. And then I'm going to start up a PowerPoint.
Looking good? Yep.
Okay. Everybody can see that? Okay. And again, Andy Thomas and J.R. Fennel, feel free to step in whenever you want to. I will be showing some pictures of the Cayce Historical Museum, the old Cayce house, a photo from that. And JR, I'll be showing a picture of the Granby building, which you have, and those would be certainly opportunities to give us some more information on those. All right, so when John asked me to do this, I was a little bit overwhelmed. There's a lot of stuff that happened in the 18th century, and this is the area I'll be talking about, which happens to be just a 1 square mile area. And I'll come back to this picture in the very end and talk a little bit about, some endangered areas in here that we need to keep an eye on. So as John kind of covered, these are the topics. Those first 7 bullets, I could probably each spend an hour on each of those. We don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to be moving through this fast. The last little bullet is not the 18th century, but it's just a little funny thing I would throw in at the end just to show how the history continues in this area. All right, so in the beginning, it was Hernando de Soto, and he had 4 men that traveled here back in 1539, and 4 of them maintained journals. And over the years, here's an example: Charles Hudson, who was an anthropologist. He spent much of his career tracing where De Soto went, mainly based on these journal entries that, whenever they came to a creek or a river, it was often a challenge to cross it. And these guys chronicled it quite well and allowed us to figure this out. As you can see, Hudson shows De Soto crossing just on the Broad River, just above Columbia. There are actually 5 possible sites that the crossing could have occurred at, where there were fords in the river. And Hudson believes the site was right behind the Broad River Correctional Facility. And there's also a 5th site, which is across from where we found Fort Congaree too. This was a Catawba trail and also a ford during that period. But there's no evidence of De Soto yet found in this area. I've heard through the grapevine that not too far from Columbia, evidence has been found. Of course, a lot of evidence has been found in Florida and some in Georgia. But that's just something to keep in mind. This could become a part of the 12,000-year history as we learn more. But the first piece of evidence that we do have is a 1789 survey. And you'll hear me talk a lot about surveys because I think that's been a real point of success in the stuff I've done. There's a big difference between a map and a survey. For instance, the Mills Atlas contains gross errors in it, but the atlas was based on the 1818 state surveys, which are extremely accurate. So you always want to try to use a survey or a land plat if you have an opportunity, if you're searching for something. So this one in 1789, this was right after Columbia was chosen to be a new city and where our capital would be formed instead of at Granby. So the Taylor family had some property just south of Granby on the other side of the Congaree River, and they wanted to get rid of it before the value dropped. I'm sure that's the reason. So they had this survey done. And you can see in the upper left portion where there's some lots drawn out. So this was to be in addition to Granby. But what we're interested in is on the right side of this survey. This is Congaree Creek. And in 1789, Fort Congaree I was long gone and really long forgotten, I think. But that green little boxed area is where Fort Congaree I was. The most significant thing about that fort is probably the settlement that was built next to it. Some people call it St. John's Settlement. On the survey, it just says settlement. And there's a group of what looks like buildings or properties, but then there's another squared off section, which if that were a building, it would be 70 feet by 50 feet. And I think this may have been the trading post where Irishman Thomas Brown started his trading career. Actually, it was Thomas and his brother, Patrick. Patrick would not stick around for long. But Brown was I call him a new kind of trader. He was born about 1700 in Northern Ireland, came to Charlestown about 1725, where he met George Haig, and you will hear about Haig more later on. A friendship developed and a partnership, and Brown and Haig began trading goods between Charlestown and the Indians in the backcountry. So in 1718, you had Fort Congaree I was built because of problems with the Indians, and settlers soon moved in to the area. The garrison for the fort only lasted about 4 years, and then this little settlement continued. Brown, by the time he arrived in 1725, the fort was abandoned, and he opened up a trading post. Now, a lot of this information I have on Brown comes from an author, James Merrill. He's a professor of history, and he wrote the book. It was a really good book called The Indians' New World Catawbas and Their Neighbors from European Contact Through the Era of Removal. So he has a lot of information about Brown, and he believes Brown was the one who started the Congaree factory trading post. Brown soon married a Catawba woman, and they had 2 children about 1729 and 1730. The children named William and Elizabeth. And Brown became fluent in the Catawba language, and he was often requested by the government to be a translator and to help solve any problems that came up. Brown, and this is a big difference with Brown, unlike other traders, he married this Catawba woman, they had children, and he was very active in the raising of those children, which was a bit unusual. And he really embraced his Catawba family. He did everything with them, and he even fought with the Catawbas. And he didn't cheat the Indians like many other traders did. And I think this had a profound effect during the period of time that Brown was here. I think his wife probably died fairly young, and Brown took over the raising of the 2 children. Again, this impressed the Catawba people. And there was just a great mutual respect, I think, between Brown and the Catawba people.
David,
Yes.
I want to just mention that this is a period now when there can be private traders again. There was a period after the Amnesty War in which the only place you could trade was at a military post like Fort Congaree I. But I think it was 1721 or 1722, the legislature passed legislation that said that private traders could get back into the game. And so Brown is getting back into the game.
Okay.
Is one of those private traders.
Okay, great info. Thank you for that. So it for the a big reason, I think, Chris Judge spoke a couple weeks back, and he said he thinks a big reason the Catawba were not removed from the area, during the period of Trail of Tears, is because maybe it was because they were small, only 1,000 people, but it could have also been that the Catawba people had always shown to the Europeans, always siding with them. And I think, from reading all this stuff about Brown, that had a lot to do with Brown, the trust and loyalty that they had with him. And yeah, so Brown, he started off there near the fort, Andy, and then he moved away from it. And we'll be seeing that here and this is some more points made by Merrill. So he started off at the fort. It became a very popular place for the Indians. The European residents, however, I think were a little nervous about this, and they filed a complaint and wanted Brown evicted from the area. This was about 1734, I think. And so, and I think it's at this point that Patrick, his brother, just left the area. Brown then, soon after this, moved up, and about this time is when we had the planning of the Saxe-Gotha settlement, which was just north of the Fort Congaree 1 area in this other little settlement. So I believe Brown actually targeted moving above that area of Saxe-Gotha, and he would eventually purchase that piece of land in 1740 and start another post there. So here's a map, 1757, which shows both forts. The big square block there is the Saxe-Gotha settlement. Below it is Fort Congaree 1, what we call Fort Congaree 1, and above it is Fort Congaree 2. Brown would have moved just above where Fort Congaree 2 is, and partly because of the Saxe-Gotha property, which also included a reservation for Fort Congaree 2, even long before that fort was built. And you can see that here in the Saxe-Gotha survey, which was made about in the 1730s, and some things were added to it over time. But again, this is a survey, it's very accurate. You can notice the fort up here, Fort Congaree 2, the star, and there's a pond next to it. These other canals, man-made canals, some of those you can still find the remnants today. And down here, way on the bottom, there's a little house with a chimney and smoke coming out of it. And Leo Redmond, when we did an overlay of this some years back, Leo Redmond went out to that site and actually found chimney stones. So this was a very accurate survey showing the future Fort Congaree 2. So Brown would have moved a little upriver of this point to start his second post. And here's some plats, which are also surveys, again, a really good thing. And we know that John Matthews, so in the Saxe-Gotha settlement, what I just showed you were a bunch of town lots. They were small lots, maybe 100 feet by 200. But then these people, when they came over, they were also given a much bigger piece of land outside of the town. And like here you see Martin Friday, there's 250 acres for him. John Matthews would get 100 acres, and this is the area that Thomas Brown had moved to, and Brown would eventually purchase that property from John Matthews. Brown would die in 1747. I think he was probably ill in 1746. It was documented then that his new business and location had become a very popular trading post. Soon after his death, Martin Friday bought the property, and now Friday had two big chunks of property, which would later become Granby. And Martin Friday would, by about 1748 or 49, he had opened up a ferry known as Friday's Ferry. In 1746 is when we start to see problems with the native population popping up. And I think it's no coincidence that this started about the time of Brown's death. So Brown, among other things we've done in researching, I've been very involved over the last, I guess it's 6 or 7 years now, with the King Richard III DNA project and genealogy. And so one of the things I wanted to do was look down and see the descendants of Thomas Brown. And here's a maternal line from him and his wife, Catawba wife, which it would be really neat because it comes down to today. We have people living today, and I'm sure that they probably have no idea that Thomas Brown is their 8th great grandfather. But more important, this particular person would carry the same mitochondrial DNA as Brown's Catawba wife. So there's some historical and scientific importance to following up on this. But it's difficult. People don't appreciate you prying into their genealogy and especially their DNA. So you have to be careful when you're doing this, but this is something we'll be working on in the future. So for locating Brown's site, in about 2007 or 8, local surveyor, William Schumpert, who's also a history buff, put together plats and figured out where the road to Friday's Ferry was. And he goes down to the Congaree River at that spot and he finds this structure in the water. He notified the property owners, who are Martin Marietta of the quarry. They paid for archaeology, and the archaeologist dated this structure to be 1800, and they found the old roadbed to Friday's Ferry. So this was about I think it's about 40 feet long. Most of it is buried now, and some of it is, you can see it if the river's really, really low. I was always confused though. I went out and checked it out early on, and what would this be if it was part of a ferry? And I believe now that it's actually a part of one of Wade Hampton's bridges. So by the 1790s, Hampton and his brother Richard had the rights to the ferry site, and Wade Hampton built 3 bridges here in the 1790s. The most magnificent, which it was described as, is the world's first curvilinear bridge. Hampton was not an engineer or a bridge builder, but he somehow thought that building a bridge in an arched shape like this would give it more strength. It didn't really work, but there's evidence of this. On the other side of the river from that ferry structure, we find cut stones and an abutment for a bridge. In the middle, there are things in the river which match the construction techniques Hampton used in mounting wooden piers into the ground with lead. So we think the bridge looked like this, but this is another project that we're working on. It's possibly could be the first documented covered bridge in the United States. Currently, the first one known is about 1806 or something like this. So this is in the 1790s. So this is worth researching here, and would be another piece of history for the 12,000 year history part. So during the investigation, looking at that structure that Schumpert found, my wife and I, as we were, this thing is found almost right at the end of phase 2 of the Cayce River Walk. And coming out of that, this is in the year 2010, there were a number of foreclosures in the Riverland Park neighborhood there. And there was a house right on the corner. And we got up, walked around the property, and the same old feeling came over me as with our previous property where we found the old bridge abutment. And we purchased the property. It was in pretty bad shape. But 2 years later, my wife and I went on a professional archaeological dig. We came back and decided, we're going to start up something here and see if we can find anything of the town of Granby, which should have been right in that area of Friday's Ferry. And almost immediately we started finding artifacts from the colonial period. That was the beginning of the Finding Granby project. We've had probably almost now maybe 150 volunteers that have taken part in this. And after 8 years, we now have found over 18,000 artifacts. Most of them are from Granby, 1760 to 1825, but a significant number of them are probably from Thomas Brown's trading post. And in archaeology, this is not unusual at all. Brown started this popular trading post. Roads were built to it, paths, and later on it was just built on top of by a really nice Granby house, which I'll give you an image of what that may have looked like. We did other things too. Once again, another survey. That's the 1818 survey up on the upper right. It doesn't look pretty like the Mills Atlas, but it's very accurate, and it showed a little squared off area, the main town part of Granby, and a creek coming in on the other side of the river. Well, we combined that with an 1871 survey showing that creek before it was eliminated by the quarry. And then we knew this was the main town square area of Granby. You can see our big site is in red right here. You can see the old state road used to cut through here. It's been moved out here so that it can go around the Cayce quarry. one of the other things we discovered in the South Caroliniana Library was the only real image we have of Granby, drawn by Sarah Friday, the great granddaughter of Martin Friday, in about 1815, probably. And as you can see, much of Granby is now in the quarry hole. The Cayce house, which the Cayce Historical Museum is a replica of, as also, of course, that building fell down in the 1940s, but its location is now within the quarry hole also. And then over on the other side here, we got a big slag pile that's covering up another big important part of Granby. But then just down from that, though, is our dig site, and there are some opportunities in here. One of the little buildings shown here, I believe, was a law office, which is now that building in the at the Lexington County Museum, which I think it was the first post office in Lexington. It was actually moved. It was, my understanding is, it was not taken apart and moved. It was actually rolled into Lexington, which was quite a feat. So let's see. So now I want to show you that, and this is what I think the newer Granby homes look like. So the one we're digging, which I believe was built about 1784 or 85, I believe it would have looked very much like this because of what we're finding. It's a brick foundation. There's no post going in the ground here. We find lots of brick along with window glass, in pits. We found, pieces of, the door lock, and when you put it together and you look at a little overlay of all what the things we found, we see kind of an outline of a building. And so, this is something like what you might see at Colonial Williamsburg. The Granby people were very wealthy. We know from the pottery we find it was expensive, imported English pottery. The people of Granby had twice as many slaves as the average Lexington family would have. So they would have had nice homes. But still, right there underneath the stuff we find in Granby, we find post holes. And could this be something older? My first impression after these are adjacent pits, I wanted to look at this and say, well, this kind of points to something. What happens if we take a line perpendicular to these center two post holes and look out? And well, in fact, it points directly at the landing, Friday's Ferry, and where Wade Hampton would build his bridges. So this may have been this road here called Platte Springs Road in one historical document. This was probably there for a very long time. And then I think another road ran through here, a frontage road along the Congaree River. So Brown would have been, his trading post would have been a log cabin. He would not have had windows in his building, and would have just been your basic log cabin. Probably, I think, I estimate based on what we found, it may have been about a 1,200 square foot building. And then artifacts. So we also find right around those post holes, we found in two different pits, a Jew's harp, a musical instrument. And Jonathan Leader, who keeps an eye on all the things we're doing, he's the state archaeologist. These were fairly small Jew's harps, and he believes they were early 1700s. And we found both of them, two different pits. They were both mixed with charcoal. So, these Jew's harps, they have a little tongue, I guess you call it, on it that vibrates. And when that breaks off, it's useless. So, I imagine you had Thomas Brown, maybe some of his Catawba friends are playing these instruments around a fire. The tongue breaks off and they toss the instrument into the fire. And then we find it all these years later. We find lots of this green wine bottle. Some people call it black glass. A complete top, two pieces that form the top. And then the bottom, we get the circumference of it. And this led to, it was one of two bottle types, but both were from the 1730s. Again, pointing to possibly Thomas Brown. And then the thing that really narrowed it down, so we find lots of pipe stems, and this is important. We found 107 pipe stems in about less than 1,500 square feet. And you can estimate the age of a pipe stem by measuring the diameter of the hole through the stem. And 80% of what we find are 1720 to 1750. And they are not English. These came from Gouda, which is, you might know Gouda from Gouda cheese, but back then Gouda was known for making pipes. They were ahead of the English at doing that, and they also pretty much invented trademarking. And on this pipe bowl, almost a complete pipe bowl that we found, we have 4 maker marks, which narrow the age of it to 1740 to 1750. Again, right there in the Thomas Brown period. But could it have also had something to do with Fort Congaree II? Because Fort Congaree II was built in 1748, and we would find Fort Congaree II just 1,000 feet to the south. So we'll get back to that later and answer that question. So this area had been plowed for at least 100 years after 1850. And that's why our artifacts are broken into small pieces. But one of the things that surprised me, and this is not unusual in archaeology, these, even all that plowing, things still tend to stay in the same place. Our pipe stem breakdown, the level at which we find them shows that we have 3 different age ranges for pipe stems, and the older ones are found deeper in the ground, which is what you would expect. And then the actual kind of horizontal position on the ground. Just last week, we did pit 112, and we found the bottom of a wine glass, which matched along with a top piece of a wine glass from pit 50 done 7 years ago and about 6 feet away. And then also definitely a hinge piece, door hinge that we found in that same pit 50. And possibly another piece of that in pit 112. So again, these pieces tend to stay close to each other despite all the plowing that was done. English brown salt glazed stoneware. This has a big age range on it, but in the areas where we find a lot of Thomas Brown stuff, we've found some very primitive looking pieces of this. And then of course, Native American artifacts. We've only found 3 or 4 points like this. We find lots of pieces of pottery, but this one, interestingly, when we dig, the ground is a very rich soil, very dark, but as soon as it turns light colored, sandy, the Granby and Thomas Brown artifacts disappear. This point, Dalton Point, potentially could be 10,000 years old, was found in that sandy part. We were just finishing up a hole and heard a little ching, and we were running the trowel through it. And this popped out. Tobacco in one pit, the very bottom of the pit, again, probably Native American time frame. We found this little bit of charcoal particles, about what you would fit in a pipe bowl, and with a microscope, it appears it could be actually seeds from wild tobacco. Europeans did not like to smoke the seeds of tobacco, but the natives did, especially in ceremonies. And then here's some of the native pieces. You can see they're small. The pottery gets broken up easily, but also some tools, nutters, churps, scrapers. And now let's get back to one of the plats. So about 2 years into the Granby dig, Dean Hunt, local historian, Lexington historian, came across this plat in 1750 that shows Fort Congaree II. So now we have an image of the fort after it's been built, not just a reservation for the fort. And it's relative to a pond. And so this Fort Congaree II, this is an image. Yep, go ahead. This is a image of, I think it's Fort Prince George, which is up near Clemson. This was a site that was completely excavated. And so we have a good image of it. This would have been about the same time as Fort Congaree too. So we think these forts were probably very similar in appearance. And the history of Fort Congaree too, it was garrisoned between 1748 and 1754. It was built to protect the locals. You know, as I mentioned before, that problems with the Indians started happening again around 1746. And this was the answer. The garrison left, the heart of the garrison left to help George Washington at Fort Necessity in 1754. For over 200 years of the two Congaree forts, really only Fort Congaree II was recognized and remembered. Fort Congaree I was completely forgotten until the 1970s when archaeologists actually discovered it on Congaree Creek. Dr. Edwin Green of the University of South Carolina in 1930s pleaded for a marker to be put at the last signs of Fort Congaree II. He noted its location, which goes along with exactly where we found it later on. And here's Brown. Brown wrote a lot of articles in the state newspaper, really, some really good stuff. I wish he had gone into more detail about the signs of the fort, but I think we figured that out. A 1930s aerial photo of the area interestingly shows where we found Fort Congaree II. The land does not appear to have been plowed. It appears to have been plowed everywhere else. There's a roadbed going to it, which leads us to believe that people knew what this was and they left it. They left whatever was remaining and they didn't touch it. So the history, we covered a little bit this before, and here comes the name George Haig again. So, you know, you get at this time, 46, Thomas Brown dies. That caused a problem. Then you also had the French and the British who were fighting, and the French started bringing in other Indian tribes like the Cherokee to carry out attacks and kidnappings against the Catawba people and the settlers. And Governor James Glenn employed George Haig to negotiate with the Cherokee. Well, Haig had lost his partner, Thomas Brown, but he engages Brown's son now, William Brown, and they go on a mission to visit the Catawbas. If Thomas Brown had been alive, I don't believe this would have happened. Brown knew how to move around and about with the Indians, but Haig and William Brown were kidnapped by Indian allies of the French. In the ordeal, Haig finally had enough and told his captors they would have to kill him, that he would not cooperate anymore, and they promptly executed Haig. Well, this was really the last straw for the settlers who had been experiencing a lot of violence from these Indians that were employed by the French. And in fact, George Haig's widow, Elizabeth, played a big part in convincing the governor that they had to have a fort here for protection, Fort Congaree too. So that fort was under construction in 1748. And a few years later, Peter Mercier becomes the second commander of the fort. And things were going pretty good here. The Catawba had really moved in. It sounds like they may have had a number of people camped outside of the fort. They may have even been inside of the fort. And Mercier made a point to invite Indians of other tribes like the Cherokee to show off what they had at this fort as kind of a warning to, don't mess with us. So things were going okay. Peter Mercier met and became friends with the widow of George Haig, Elizabeth, and they married. And things were looking good until 1754 in June, when Washington sends a message. Washington had gotten into trouble. He killed a group of French men who were a part of a scouting party, and the French were after Washington, tracking him down. And Fort Congaree, Mercier, and probably about 6 of his men headed out to Virginia to help Washington. On the way, Mercier has a premonition and he writes his last will and testament, leaving everything to Elizabeth. They arrived just in time and helped Washington build Fort Necessity, and on July the 1st, and then 2 days later, the French and their Indians arrive and attack. Mercier is shot twice. Both times he gets up and continues the fight, and a third shot ended his life. All the other men from Fort Congaree too also died that day in the battle, but the life of George Washington was saved. At the time, the Deputy Postmaster General of North America paid tribute to Mercier. That was none other than Benjamin Franklin, and wrote this nice little poem and talking about the tragic loss of Mercier, his heroics and his tragic loss. By 1760, so really that was the heart of Fort Congaree too, and the fort had fallen into disrepair by 1760. But Colonel James Grant chose the fort site as the training ground for 2,800 men, British regulars and South Carolina provincials. Among these young men were Francis Marion, William Moultrie, Isaac Huger, and Andrew Pickens. As they moved out toward the town of 96, the Cherokee attempted an ambush, and it was sounds like a really bloody battle. The Cherokee ran out of ammunition, however, and were defeated. And then Grant and his men, without resistance, systematically burned 15 Indian towns and destroyed over 1,500 acres of their crops. The Cherokee chief at that point, knowing that the British Army was also moving in, the British chief gave up on the fight. And without them, by 1763, the French gave up also, and the French-Indian War was over. So if there's one thing I think from this talk that you should walk away with, or I'd like for you to walk away with, is that is these two paragraphs, these young South Carolina men that took part in that final phase of Fort Congaree too. These men, they would go on to be heroes of the American Revolution, aided by their former foe, the French. They would turn the revolution around in South Carolina and drive the British to their final battle at Yorktown, and where they would fall to none other than General George Washington, who had been saved 27 years earlier by the men of Fort Congaree too.
David,
So you see, yeah.
as a postscript to that, then when Washington becomes president in 1791, he takes a tour of the South. And on that tour, he actually goes through Ramsey on his way to the new capital of South Carolina.
Yep, thanks. And I'll be actually showing that, the painting you have in your museum, Andy. Beautiful painting of that. Yep, that's right, yeah. And you wonder what, I heard someone say that, Washington did at one point, I think maybe when he was president, make a comment of Fort Congaree too, to give those men credit for what they had done. So here's some of those men as they were a little bit older in life, so we would more recognize them. So by World War II, so Fort Congaree I, Fort Congaree II. I think Fort Congaree II was really the only fort people knew about until the 1970s, when Fort Congaree I was found. And that caused a lot of confusion with people, I think. Some people thought they were one and the same, but they're not. They're, was it maybe 2 miles apart, I think. But by World War II, and you see a lot of bad things happen around the time of World War II. We lose the Cayce house; it collapses because of neglect, and then by 1960, just the lack of really leadership in the area, historical leadership. The go-ahead was given to build this Riverland Park neighborhood, and they just sent a bunch of construction guys out, and they see this mound, this square mound wall, and outside of it is a ditch around it. And they think, oh, how convenient. We'll just move all this dirt into the ditch and level everything out. And apparently that's exactly what happened. So locating Fort Congaree too, back to this survey, way back Saxgotha, and there's that reservation for a fort, the pond, doing the overlay. Here's the overlay where what Leo Redmond used, and he came out here on this dirt road, and which is now gone. There's a neighborhood built here now, but he found those chimney stones right here off that little road. There was the fort. So initially we were going to dig for the fort right where this reservation showed it, and we would have missed it. When I got there, the property was actually for sale, and we considered buying it, but I just didn't have a good feeling about it, and we held off on that. And then that's when Dean Hunt discovered this other plat that showed Fort Congaree too in 1750. So we zoomed in on that and discovered something interesting, that the Riverland Park neighborhood floods before anything else in the neighborhood. This little area it's about 4 feet lower than the rest of the neighborhood. We realized, oh, you know what? That's that pond that we see in the surveys and the land plat. So we laid things down, lining it up with that pond. We went over to where it shows the fort, this bastion, northeast bastion. We knocked on these people's door and said, Dean Hunt gave them the history of Fort Congaree too. And we said, can we dig up your front yard looking for this bastion? And they actually agreed to it. Here's the Riverland Park neighborhood. This was right, probably an hour before the Congaree River broke over the banks in 2015. But you can see in the middle of the neighborhood where this old pond is making another appearance. And that was just the beginning. This house would end up going about 4 feet in water, up halfway up the front door there, I think. And there were other documents. This from the Common Journal, 1749, which gave a distance from the ferry site to the fort, and which exactly matches up if you go along the old state road there. And so, Dr. Green, what were the signs of the fort? I just kind of mentioned it. All the wood would have been gone. It would have probably only been the mound and the ditch around the fort. We do have some details on the fort, which confirms the ditch that went around it, confirms that nails were used in the construction or documentation. And this is a very simple drawing of a fort, but it gives you an idea. So in archaeology, what we would be looking for are archaeological features related to a ditch and to a palisade wall. And in fact, when Dr. Jonathan Leader, the state archaeologist, he oversaw our project to find Fort Congaree II in the actual dig. And he made it clear from the beginning that he didn't care about artifacts. It's not going to mean anything. To prove it's a fort, you got to have archaeological evidence, which would be features of the palisade wall and a ditch. So we started working in this front yard. We ended up doing 17 1-meter square pits, and a little close up of it. And about 2 hours within the dig, just a few inches in the ground, we run into this dark spot. Somebody said, oh, well, somebody just pulled their car up here in the front yard and changed the oil and spilled oil. But we had about 6 or 7 archaeologists that day, and they went in and detected post holes in here of a palisade wall. There's a post hole that's obvious. This is one that was removed. You can see where the post was pushed and pulled to loosen it and taken out, and then fill dirt of a lighter color came in. So we continued through the entire summer, every weekend, digging, moving outward, and we began to find the features of a filled in ditch. You can see how inconsistent the soil is, the spots and all this that are in it. And the artifacts ended up, I think, being significant in themselves. We did 18 holes. And to go back to that question about Thomas Brown, was that Thomas Brown stuff we were finding over there at the Granby dig? or was it Fort Congaree too? And this answers the question. We only found in 18 pits, we only found one pipe stem and one pipe bowl piece. In the Thomas Brown site, we found 100 and, we find, a pipe stem almost every pit we dig, and we found over 300 pipe bowl pieces. So I think it answers the question that no, these pipes and stuff at Granby did not come from Fort Congaree too. And we also found nails right around where we had the palisade wall feature. There were nails on both sides. And there's a musket ball we found pretty deep. And then a little closer to the surface, we found these 3 glazed marbles, probably from the 1930s. And I believe, the site was preserved. Who knows, maybe even on July 3rd every year on the anniversary of the death of the Fort Congaree 2 men, that maybe families went out and honored that history and recognized it, and their children came along playing marbles and they left a few marbles behind. So as a last step at Fort Congaree 2, Dr. Jonathan Leader's center there wanted to do a survey or a resistivity survey. So we waited until it rained. So when it rains, you let the water seep in, and where there's a fill area, you're going to have more water and the resistance measured will be lower. And sure enough, right where we did this survey, we found a continuation of the ditch. And Dr. Leader then called it, said this is Fort Congaree 2. We found it. And there's over on the left, the area of the resistivity survey that we did. So there was the Karen and Larry's front yard, May of 2014, before we started. There's when we started digging. A few months later, the grass had not grown back too much, so we paid to have the front yard resodded. That's Karen and Larry there, and me on the right. Larry, not long after this, we planned to continue. It was really, he was the one that was so interested in the dig. And we planned to go back and do some more work, but Karen gave him lunch one day, and he went into his family room and sat down in his lazy boy and passed away. But we're happy that we gave him a little bit of excitement there toward the end. Here they are on the Karen and Larry on the front page of the state newspaper. Title, What Lies Beneath. So rebuilding Fort Congaree 2, one of the people, and some of you know him very well, Dr. Dan Tortora. Very early on, Dan researched and did a great paper on Fort Congaree 2. That is available on our website. I'll give you a link to that here in a little while. And his paper contains all of these topics here. Really nice paper. And as part of what I do, I write, as a profession, I write software, and I always wanted to get into some virtual reality. Now I had a really something really good to do with it. So I created, based on Dan's paper and what we found, I recreated this 160 by 160 area recreation of Fort Congaree 2 in virtual reality. So you're able to put on, a headset, virtual reality headset, and everything is in full size, life size, and it's in 3D. In fact, you really get kind of dizzy when you're walking along the little walkway there along the palisade wall, and you're looking out over the Congaree River. It's got a lot of detail in it. It has a scavenger hunt, so you can randomly, it'll tell you to look for certain items, and you can go around looking for them. And built a little Catawba camp. The Catawba camp was probably actually a lot bigger than this. In fact, where we put it is where neighbors have found in their backyard dozens of points and Indian pottery pieces. And then one of the barracks we dedicated to showing 3D photographs that we took during the dig, and showing our artifacts and all the work that was going on. Now I'm going to move to what's, and some of these things I'm talking about, they overlap. So Saxe-Gotha was developing during this time. And I want to move into probably something a lot of people, some people know about it, some people don't, but it was called the Weberite heresy that occurred in Saxe-Gotha. And to do this, I'm going to get out of my presentation, and I need to make sure that I've got share computer sound. And so I'm going to start this video. I'm going to let it run for a few minutes and verify with you that you're actually hearing the sound. So let me start that up here.
Decades ago, historian Clayton Cleckley wrote a piece on the Weberite heresy.
Okay, did everyone hear that?
Can't hear it, David. The volume's really.
It's a little low volume.
It's a little low. Okay, I can turn that up. Let me.
Hard to hear.
Okay, how about now?
Cleckley was chairman of the Lexington.
That's better. If you could turn it up a little bit more, that would be better.
Turn it up a little more. Okay.
May need to go to volume on now.
The museum was first established. He was later a strong force behind the creation of the Cayce.
Is that good?
Better.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start it over here. Okay.
Decades ago, historian Clayton Cleckley wrote a piece on the Weberite heresy. Cleckley was chairman of the Lexington County Museum Commission when the museum was first established. He was later a strong force behind the creation of the Cayce Historical Museum. Quoting Clayton about the Weberites, "A very strange sect known as the Weberites arose among the German-speaking people in Saxe-Gotha and Lower Dutch Fork, South Carolina, in 1756 to 1761. This cult originated along the Saluda River in the neighborhood of Youngener's Ferry. Its area of local influence extended from Little Mountain to the confluence of Broad and Saluda rivers. The sect originated with Jacob Weber, who was born in Switzerland and was raised and educated in the Reformed Church. He came to South Carolina at the age of 14 with a brother. Weber prospered early in life as a local planter, but the death of his brother caused him to question his religion and the state of his own soul. In May of 1756, inner excitement reached a climax in his soul-searching experiences. Weber shared his religious enthusiasm with his neighbors by inviting them in for Sunday hymn and singings and readings from sermon books. He was encouraged by the response he received, and those meetings seemed to be beneficial. Gradually, the participants began to admire the reader, which in turn caused him to admire himself. The more recognition he received, the more esteem he had for his talents. During the peaceful years of 1758 and 1759, this bizarre sect caused no problem in the settlements. It became evident that the Cherokee War had made deep impressions and caused strain among the followers of Jacob Weber. Saxe-Gotha and the Dutch Fork did not escape the Indian raids. Cherokee parties penetrated their forests and emerged to scalp, murder, and burn. The grave dislocations and terror of the Cherokee War diluted these early settlements. The ravages of Indian warfare hung over the German and Swiss settlements of Saxe-Gotha and Dutch Fork by spring of 1760. The people in this locality were without schools. While this caused little concern before the Cherokee War, the lack of instruction was sorely felt as the population increased. The spiritual condition of the settlers was most deplorable, as the self-appointed ministers usually wandered into the settlements only a few times a year. The Church of England was the official church at the time, but it was not accepted by the German-speaking inhabitants of the area. After a season of depression and the ending of the Cherokee War, Jacob Weber became obsessed with the idea that he was the deity. He began to put aside the teachings of the Bible and preach out of his own spirit. Jacob Weber won over 2 co-workers who desired to be no less important in the meetings of the cult. They too professed most extraordinary revelations and helped to promote the sect. Meanwhile, the three leaders adjusted their differences by agreeing that Jacob Weber should represent and act like God the Father. Peter Schmidt was Jesus, and a third person, Mr. Dauber, a godless black preacher, was the Holy Spirit. These three leaders of the sect claimed to be the Holy Trinity. It was said that Peter Schmidt was a co-founder of the sect. Jacob Weber's wife, Hannah, was declared the Virgin Mary. With this organization, the sect grew stronger and stronger and practiced the most atrocious blasphemies. This religious disorder swept through the German and Swiss settlements. The sect gained so much momentum that neighbors joined it because they feared for the safety of their lives. Jacob Weber was determined that unconverted members must be healed through his efforts. Groups of both sects went about unclothed and naked and practiced outrageous atrocities. In their religious rites, they often fell into trances. They sanctioned nudity and marital confusion. The Reverend Christian Theus lived near the Congarees and endeavored to serve that area in Saxe-Gotha for over 50 years, beginning in 1739. Learning of the activities of the Weberites, he came unexpectedly into their midst, finding Jacob Weber contending that he was the deity and that the unconverted members must be healed through him. Because Pastor Theus opposed their blasphemy, he enraged the Weberite leaders. They threatened his life, pausing only to decide whether he should be drowned or hanged. Apparently, only the intervention of a kind-hearted Negro enabled Theos to escape. Finally, the three Weberite leaders began quarreling amongst themselves. Jacob Weber and Peter Schmidt disagreed with the third man, Mr. Dauber, who represented himself as the Holy Spirit. Weber and Schmidt agreed that Dauber was not properly exercising the office of the Spirit, and that he was neither hot or cold, but only lukewarm. They placed a mattress on the bottom of a pit, threw Dauber in, and piled more mattresses and pillows on him. Members of the sect leaped in upon Dauber and trampled him until he suffocated. The corpse was then taken out of bed and thrown into a burning pile of wood to be consumed to ashes. Soon afterward, Weber quarreled with Schmidt, the son. He declared Peter Schmidt to be Satan in disguise and ordered him chained to a tree. The band surrounded Schmidt, struck him with their fist, and beat him until he fell to the ground. Finally, they danced around him and trampled upon his throat until he was dead. These atrocious murders were committed on February 23rd and 24th in 1761. Charleston authorities learned of these murders by the Weberites, and soon the whole province was shocked by the crimes. After another murder in February of 1761, the leading members of the sect were brought to Charlestown for trial. Jacob Weber, his wife Hannah Weber, John Giger, the possible father of Emily Giger, and Jacob Burghardt were tried in Charleston and condemned to death. Jacob Weber was convicted and hung in April of 1761, but the others were pardoned by Lieutenant Governor William Bull.
Okay, so start today. This is where the Weberite church stood. This is a raw sewage treatment pond right by the Cayce boat landing. So that was a fitting in for the church, I suppose. And this leads me to, as we mentioned, the potential father of Emily Giger. So now we shift over to the story of Revolutionary War heroine Emily Giger. And I interviewed John Howell at the Cayce Museum a couple months back. This was for the Orangeburg German-Swiss Genealogical Society. It's about a 45-minute video. And here's that link to the website. If you go here, you will see links to the different projects, Granby, Fort Congaree 2, the Emily Giger. There's a link to this video. So I would recommend watching the entire interview here, but what I'm going to do right now is play a short little video about the ride of Emily Giger. And this was done also for the society.
"'Twas in the days of the Revolution, dark days were they and drear, and by the Carolina firesides the women sat in fear. For the men were away at fighting, and sad was the news that came, that the battle was lost, and the death list held many a loved one's name. When his heart sore that sat round the campfires, what ho! Who'll volunteer to carry a message to Sumter?" A voice rang loud and clear. There was a sudden silence, but not a man replied. They knew too well of the peril of one who dared that ride. Outspoke then Emily Giger, with a rich flush on her cheek. "Give me the message to be sent. I am the one you seek. For I am a Southern woman, and I'd rather do and dare than sit by a lonely fireside, my heart gnawed through with care." They gave her the precious missive, and on her own good steed she rode away mid the cheers of the men upon her daring deed. And away through the lonely forest, steadily galloping on, she saw the sun sink low and in the west go down. "Halt, or I fire!" On a sudden, a rifle clicked close by. "Let you pass? Not we, till we know you are no messenger or spy." "She's a Whig, from her face, I will wager," swore the officer of the day. "To the guardhouse, and send for a woman to search her without delay." No time did she lose in bewailing as the bolt creaked in the lock. She quickly drew the precious note that was hidden in her frock, and she read it through with hurried care, then ate it piece by piece, and calmly sat her down to wait till time should bring release. They brought her out in a little, and set her on her steed, with many a rude apology for this discourteous deed. On and on through the forest black, the good horse panting strains, till the sentry's challenge, "Who comes there?" tells that the end she gains. Ere an hour in the camp of Sumter, there was hurrying to and fro. Saddle and mount, the bugles shrilly blow. Forward trot, and the long ranks wheel, and into the darkness glides. Long shall the British rue that march, and Emily Giger's ride.
Okay, so let me go back now to the, did everybody hear that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, let's see. So John Howe, that was kind of an intro. John Howe's spent about 10 years researching Emily Giger, and I'm sorry for flip-flopping on the pronunciation. I want to say Giger, like as in Geiger counter, but people in South Carolina, the real Gigers from that line, they seem to all pronounce it as Giger. So that's probably the way you should say it. So some of the points I just want to make, you can watch the full interview, but some of the points from John Howe's research is, of course, the confusion of the genealogy of Emily. It's very difficult when you get back to her parents, which brought up the question, was John Giger her father, the John Giger that was in the Weberite heresy? And John found that her family had property up on the Broad River, and so did that John Giger from the Weberite. So that was that raised that possibility. State historian A.S. Sally, in I think some of his last years, tried to prove that Emily never existed. But there are period eyewitness accounts that show Emily and her ride were actually very real, including accounts from people that lived in Granby. She had friends in Granby, and her interrogation there by the British were actually occurred at Fort Granby. And then another point John makes as why it was never documented by these great generals, General Greene and General Sumter. And John felt like it was, as seen in the war between the states, these high-ranking officials often did not give credit to people, and certainly would not have given credit to a teenage girl. And just what was in Emily's message. Most people believe it was a message for a plan for Greene and Sumter to combine forces to go against the British Stuart and Rawdon. And ultimately, this action did occur, and it prevented these British forces from joining Cornwallis, who was being encircled at Yorktown by General George Washington. And of course, Cornwallis was forced to surrender because he had no help there. So very significant. And I don't know, at this point, Andy, is there anything you'd like to add about Emily along these lines?
I'll just say that if you visit our museum, we, of course, have a room that's set aside for Emily Geiger, and she's in all her glory up there, waiting for the loyalists to come in and search her.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks, Andy. Yeah, and you've also got a nice plaque outside the museum for her too. Okay. So John Howe, so moving along with this, another part of John Howe's work was to actually find her grave. And there have been other people involved in this, financial support. We've, as John, ultimately the piece of evidence that really solved it was a state newspaper article from the early 1900s by Three Wits. So Emily married a man named Three Wits, and this man in the early 1900s gave a testimony that he knew where her grave was, and he gave a relative position of it to another grave, which is actually the only grave now that was still standing. And so John went out in that approximate area using his dowsing rods and found what he thought was a grave. The group of people supporting this project paid for some professionals to come out with GPR, and they found a grave in that exact spot, and also a smaller grave, the grave of a child. And it's believed that Emily died from complications of childbirth, and that her child died about the same time. So Emily died young, which is one reason there's no documentation on her. She never owned any property. And the purpose of the project, as you saw in that one picture, I think I've got another one here, yeah, that shows where they have a temporary marker for her right now, and there will be a stone marker put there. And John Howe is organizing a funeral service to be done for her in April. I think the Daughters of the American Revolution may be involved in that also. So that work continues. There's another Geiger Cemetery not too far from this where people believed Emily had been buried, but that's not correct. Emily lived according to this eyewitness, Emily lived her entire life at this site at a house right next to this cemetery. She died there. Her husband remarried and then moved to another nicer home, which this same group of people is also trying to save that home. It's in pretty bad shape right now. So if you wonder where this is at, Charleston Highway and I-26 is the location. You get off there, you go down this golf court road, and you kind of turn off, and there's a trailer sitting there and a little tool shed, and it's just right by that. The owner has made this available, opened it up, and we're still trying to figure out where to put an official marker. We'll probably put it out on the main road and just give a general direction to it. So again, Emily was interrogated at Fort Granby, and that leads us to Fort Granby, a store that would become a Revolutionary War British fort, and whose fort name would be passed on to the village that was chosen to be the new capital of South Carolina. So here is the later known as the Cayce House. It was originally Joseph Kershaw and James Chestnut of Camden opened this trading post in 1765, about that time. And when the Revolution started, the British took it over, converted it into a fort, did a bunch of stuff outside, putting up mounds, walls, whatever. And of course, probably maybe the two biggest events of the Revolutionary War in the Midlands anyway are the sieges of Fort Granby. On May the 1st, 1781, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hampton attacked British detachments guarding Friday's Ferry. They killed 13 men there, and then chased after another group and killed 5 more of them. That siege didn't last long, but then on May 14th and 15th, we got some big name people coming in, and this was the big siege, which was successful. And there you see.
David,
Yes.
your date should be 1781, right?
Yeah, you're right. That's wrong. Yeah, did I get the first? I got the first one right. Yeah, that should be 1781. Sorry about that.
Got a double date there also, 14 and 15. So I was going to point out both of those to you, but John beat me to it. But
Okay.
And one other, the first siege was February of 1781 with Sumter.
Oh, was it February?
It
Or
was Sumter actually was taking the fort, and unfortunately, Lord Rawdon from Camden arrived on the other side of the river with a larger force. So all that Sumter could do is destroy like some of the provisions and destroy the magazine and get out of there. So.
Okay. I need to correct my dates there. Okay, thanks, Andy. And
to replace your comma with a dash, you know, it
yeah.
kind of
Okay.
confusing.
Okay. All right. And so here's that first event where all the men were killed at Friday's Ferry, just showing you a picture here of where our dig site is relative to that. And we do find a number of, I think we've up to like about 25 musket balls that we found at that location. And here's a painting from the Cayce Historical Museum. So Andy, is this, what is this event here? You're on mute. You're on mute, Andy.
This is the May siege in 1781. Light Horse Harry Lee is depicted to your left in the green uniform. He is serving here with the American Legion from Virginia, and he arrives at the Congaree on a foggy morning, supposedly, and he's able to put his cannon in place before the British notice them, and then they're able to begin a siege on this fort. And eventually they overrun the fort, and the commander in the fort, Andrew Maxwell, will surrender to Light Horse Harry Lee.
Okay. And I guess this is Richland County's only claim to the Revolution, right? They set up that cannon in Richland County.
So there were several battles. I mean, talked about the two main battles, one in February, one in May, but there was also 2 follow-up battles, very short. Lord Rawdon he relieved the siege of 96, and on his way back through the area, he occupied the fort for a short while, and that may have been the time when Emily Giger set out on her ride. But then following that, on July 3rd, Nathaniel Greene actually is on his way through the area. He captures the fort for the 4th time, and Nathaniel Greene, of course, is the commander of the Patriot forces in this area.
Okay, great. That's why we have professional historians here helping me out here. Great, thanks, Andy. And So here's that building in around the year 1900, I believe. And it's got some of the Cayce family on here. And I'm not going to go into the genealogy because it's really confusing about, but you know, this is how Cayce got its name though, and how the house became named Cayce, the Cayce house eventually. But this is a really nice picture of it from that time. And then we're going to give you a little comparison. So on the right is the Cayce Historical Museum. Nice replica of it, as you can see. And do you have anything you want to add to that, Andy?
The house was still standing in the 30s and 40s, and John Ellisor lived fairly close by. And John Ellisor was fascinated by the structure, and he actually drew it. And I think John Ellisor was an architect, so he was really interested in dimensions and all of that kind of stuff. So he had that all down. And so when the house began to deteriorate, the last person living in the Cayce house, they died in the 1920s. The family actually moved in town closer to where Cayce is today. So the house was abandoned and it sat there for years. And it began to deteriorate. And as I understand it, people began to actually ransack it to get like wood and brick and stuff. And there was a storm that came along in 1948 that knocked down a part of it. And eventually the quarry decided they would just dismantle the rest of it. So they dismantled the rest of it. And of course, after they did that, they were able to dig, underneath where it sat. So now it's just part of the quarry hole that's there. So,
yeah, okay.
And the museum itself was reconstructed, or this structure was reconstructed as the museum in 1989, 1990 was the period that they opened up the Cayce Historical Museum.
Okay. All right, thank you. There's another little view with a marker there. Here's a grave that one thing that does survive from Granby. This is Anne Friday. You get these Fridays and Giegers and Cayce. It's a little bit confusing, but there is a cemetery within the quarry property, and they supposedly are supposed to have public days where you can go in and see this. So there it was, Emily Giger. I think this is a drawing of when she was captured and taken to Fort Granby, which eventually was called the Cayce House. And going back to some of our evidence and things we found, this is a pretty neat little thing. This connects to the Cayce Historical Museum also. First, it looked like a nail, but when we cleaned it up, we realized it was a unique piece, which we eventually identified as being the lock tumbler in a 9-inch stock lock from England. And in the Congarees store account book, which the Cayce Historical Museum acquired some years back, we find there's only one 9-inch stock lock sold there, and it was to Jacob Giger. We knew from Sarah Friday's drawing of Granby that Abraham Giger lived right across from our dig site, and that likely Jacob may have been a son of his. So we believe that this date, which is 1784, might be when Jacob Giger was actually building the house that we are digging. And that store account book is fascinating. We had Kathy Keenan is her name. She did a master's thesis in history, and she asked us, she did it on Granby. She asked us how she could help, and we told her, well, could you go in and index, and transcribe the entire store account book? And she did that. And here's some stats, and you can see, a pretty good fluctuation of sales. But then in 1786, and this was really the day when it was announced that Granby would not be the capital. Granby was an unhealthy place, and we're going to build the new capital of South Carolina on the other side of the river. And you see the store just shuts down. And I believe this is at the point in the account book where they actually have in big capital letters, Amen. And I'm not sure what that means exactly, but shortly after that, you can see the store got busy again because they had to build Columbia, and Granby was the only place where you could purchase materials and things. So there was a lot of activity in Granby during the building of Columbia. And how fitting it is, the only coin we've found in the dig happens to be from that year, 1786, a Mexican mint silver coin. So,
David, we do have a coin here, supposedly from the site of the store and the fort and the house, that's dated 1750. It's a British coin.
oh, do you? Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so one of the things that I hear a lot is, well, where did the name Granby come from? When did it take on that name? And I think everybody agrees it came from Fort Granby. And when did it really take on? Was there a certain day when they said, absolutely, this now is Granby, stop calling this the Congarees? And I don't think that really ever happened. It was a strange transition, but the name Granby and was first given to the fort. And John Manners, really indirectly named after him, was born in a line of men who were the Earls and Dukes of Rutland and the Marquis of Granby. So he was the Marquis of Granby when he served in the 7 Years' War and commander of the British troops. And Manners in like several battles, especially the Battle of Warburg in July of 1760, he just did all these heroic things, even though his he was 1/3 the size of the enemy. They won the battle, and it was just by 1761 or 62, he was a very popular man in England. He was very well liked by the men who served under him. In fact, he would buy his men that served under him pubs so that they could run after they retired from the military. And John Manners died in 1770, died relatively young, and he was in great debt because of his generosity that he had for other people. So we know that likely when the revolution started, he was a really still by in 1770 death. Then he would have been very well known, and we think the British named the fort after him. And just when did that name catch on? Because when it was decided to form Columbia, actually documentation uses Friday's Ferry as the site of the new state capital, not Granby, even though Friday's Ferry is in the middle of Granby. So I think even at that time, you had a lot of people that were still not calling it Granby. And I believe it was not until 1804 that Granby was actually given the county seat of Lexington. So we know by 1804, it was definitely known as Granby. Now this is the courthouse rebuilt of Granby at just across from the First Presbyterian Church. They had it dismantled and rebuilt there. Later became the home of someone, but it was torn down, I believe, in the 1740s. So nothing remains of it. And this might be where we can where JR can maybe tell us a few things. If you go to the Lexington County Museum, this is one of the first structures you see, and probably built about 1790, and it's actually one of the nicer looking structures. But this was, I believe, a law office in Granby, which was rolled on logs, possibly to Lexington, where it became the first post office. And do you have anything you want to add to that, JR? I know you've got some buildings that are older than this, a lot of them that are not quite as old.
Yeah, so it was probably built about 1791 and was rolled here to Lexington and used by a guy named Thomas Simmons at first. And he was a doctor, one of the first doctors here in town, supposed to be a a weird guy, according to some accounts, and he maybe died from eating too much ice cream. So we don't probably not true. But anyway, that's what one of the accounts said. Anyway.
Okay, okay, and the building does sit right at your entrance, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's when you come to our main entrance on Fox Street, it's one of the first buildings you see. It's right across from our tour office where you start the tours.
Oh, okay.
JR, you got to tell us the ice cream story.
Well, I mean, it's Godfrey Harmon, who was the first editor and the founder of the Lexington Dispatch newspaper. He starting in the 20s, basically, when he was an old man, he decided to kind of write down his memories of Lexington of the mid 19th century. And so one of the stories he tells, he just says that Thomas Simmons died from eating too much ice cream. So I think I did look it up a few years ago, and I believe it was typhoid that he died of, not ice cream, but so maybe Godfrey Harmon's memory was not what it used to be.
not a brain freeze then.
Yeah, not that we're aware of. So maybe something, maybe I don't know, maybe he ate a lot of ice cream and then got typhoid, and so they're like, oh, see, that's what happens, but I don't know. And then after Thomas Simmons died, he after the war, his widow became postmistress, and then their daughter, Mary Simmons Harth, she became postmistress as well. So, and it was the town's. It was not the first post office, but it was the post office after the war. So.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Thanks, JR. And so that's a good segue about the typhoid fever, because we're going to eventually get to illnesses here. But after the creation of Columbia, you can see where there's tracts of land are up for sale. You can see where Wade Hampton, Richard Hampton are actually listed there in Granby. And here's a little, this is, I think, actually came from the Cayce Museum. It's a image of Cayce. That what you see down there, those individual numbered lots, that was the addition to Granby that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. This never really developed. The red dot is where we are digging Granby right now. And you'll see at the top, it actually lists a graveyard. That's the graveyard I'm telling you that I told you about. It still exists. Other graveyards, residents of Granby had, little cemeteries in their yards, and some of those have been moved closer to this other graveyard. Some have been covered up by the slag pile. And again, here's some more things about Friday's Ferry. Lots of newspaper stories in here I want to get in. Here's another painting at the Cayce Museum. So we mentioned this before. So this is when George Washington came to Columbia, 1791. And Wade Hampton was building his first bridge, which was not complete. So George Washington had to cross at Friday's Ferry. And Andy, can you, I know that's Wade Hampton. One of those is Wade Hampton. Do you know the two other men here?
Okay, so Thomas Taylor is supposed to be part of this delegation meeting Washington, and the other is Wade Hampton Sr., which I'm assuming maybe Wade Hampton Sr. is the one in the military uniform, and Thomas Taylor is the one in the civilian clothes meeting Washington there.
Okay, great.
Washington, actually, he kept a journal all his life, and pretty much he has the journal going from Augusta to Granby. And someone asked, did he spend the night in Granby? Did he sleep here? And the answer to that is no. He arrived at dusk time, supposedly, and immediately crossed the river and actually slept that night in Columbia. It had been a long day on the road from Augusta. And he was not very happy about the heat, the mosquitoes, the fact that one of his horses had been hobbled, the fact that the day before in Augusta, one of his dogs had gone missing. So but he did make his way through Granby, and it's kind of a neat thing to think about Peter Mercer and George Washington, you know, and also the battle that, like you were talking about, Utah Springs, which held up British from joining Cornwallis, which actually helped Washington in his defeat of the British. So there's quite a few connections there that you can draw from this area in George Washington.
Yep. Yeah, there are. That's one of the kind of overwhelming things, is how do you present that, tie all these interactions and overlaps of things. Yeah. And even in this painting, you know, in the background, you see the old State House up there. Well, it was new then, brand new then. But if you go to my website, there's another link at locating the old State House on it.
Thomas Taylor actually owned land in both Granby and across the river. And the difference between the land on the river and the land he owned across the river was the land on the river flooded.
Yep.
And so they were looking, when they were looking for the state capital, didn't want a place that was going to be continually flooded. And Granby had huge floods at times. And so you're looking for high ground. And you think about the center of Columbia, you think about the University of South Carolina campus. As you go up, you'll go up, you go up. It's the high ground that sits above it all. So.
Yep. Yep. Taylor's Hill, it's called. Okay. And yeah, so that's kind of leading also to where I'm going here about the flooding. But so here at our Granby dig site, so there was actually a newspaper ad in 1790 for, I think, what is the house we are digging. So Jacob Giger may have built it, but then about 6 years later, it's for sale. And how do I know it's the same house? Well, it says it's at a distance, we have 100 yards from the landing, which is where we are. It interestingly, it mentions that it has a good well. So we've been, you know, that gets archaeologists excited when you think you might find a well. We haven't found that yet, but so, and I think I have another slide where I go into more specifics. But anyway, this was, we believe that this was the house of the Johnston family, which Sarah Friday shows in her drawing. And Johnston and his wife got married in about the summer of 1790 and moved here. So we believe this really is the ad for that property. Here's a nail we found, oh, I don't know how many, I guess it's been a couple thousand nails. Most of them are very rusted. You see this one is in pristine condition. We found about 4 or 5 like this. So these nails, this one's bent though, which is a little bit unusual. Most of them are straight. When they're made, they have an oil on them. And if they're never used, they can stay preserved. This one is obviously bent. So I don't know what the explanation is for it surviving without rust, maybe just the soil conditions it was in. But you can see, looking back at the Congarees store account book, Wade Hampton, Wade and Richard are always buying lots of nails. So they're building things. In the 1790s, they would be building bridges. Other interesting items, this again shows the wealth of the people of Granby. This is a very expensive coffee pot, and how in the world were we able to identify it from such a tiny piece? But this looks like that's what it is. Pottery. You might just think these are a bunch of broken up pieces of pottery, but most of them are pearlware. You can see the greenish blue tint to it. This was made in the late 1700s, and it was expensive. Bottles like the Thomas Brown bottle, which was from 1730, you can see this one is definitely newer looking, and it matches bottles from 1800. So this is Granby. Slaves. This one talks about this slave who is very well dressed. He's apparently maybe a runaway, but they mentioned that he's wearing clothes like a white man would wear. Again, maybe showing the wealth of the Granbyan people. And here's a little more on Sarah Friday's drawing. This is in the South Caroliniana Library. Supposedly they have the original. This one is a hand copy of the original. but it's pretty neat. There on the left, you see Captain Hart's house. You could actually do archaeology on this today. It's outside of the quarry hole, but then the Cayce house is now in the quarry hole. Peter the barber. It's really a neat drawing. This is kind of the left side of the drawing. Over here, this is more the middle, the right side. Sarah draws it all in a straight line, but in the middle of it, she actually shows Haynes Corner, and that's where the old state road takes a turn. And so I did that when I applied the overlay, I did that turn. And let's see, at the far end, you can, can't quite see it right here, but I think oh yeah, on the very far end is the Johnston house where we're digging. And these little smaller houses, you see the town well, and it's like the center of the road, which would have been the old state road that shows a well. And one of those little houses, below it down in here, buildings are probably that law office that's now at the Lexington Museum. And the tobacco, Andy, what you were talking about, that tobacco inspection building was completely washed away in the 1796 flood. And here it is on today's map. I've got partly 1939 overlay where the quarry had not expanded out so much, and you can actually see the in the 1939 picture, you can see the Cayce house down there. There's a little close up of our area. This was kind of the main square of Granby. You can see the courthouse is there, which is also the jail, and some of these other people. These were homes, and they were also stores. Many of these were stores. Abraham Giger's house is up here across from the Johnston house where we're digging.
What do you think the tree in the roadway, what do you think that is, David?
Well, if you look at, see, that's where her drawing is. It shows a tree, and there actually is a tree there just on the side of the road, that dark spot. I believe that's a tree in, 1939. There was a large tree there, and it makes me wonder, is that, yeah, I think that was some kind of tree. I can't tell, why she decided to show that. There's some significance to it. But it does appear that there was a large tree there in 1939. And you can see in some of these houses, like down here, this is the cemetery here for the family cemetery. And just back, that's that same ad in the newspaper, and where we actually are digging in the little red area here, and that's the 100-yard radius from Friday's Ferry. So there's really not, according to Sarah Friday's drawing, that's the only real house property within 100 yards of the ferry site. This is in 1815. And then we finally get to floods, so Granby, the decline started in Granby as Columbia formed. But in around 1804, Granby was named the county seat of Lexington County. So that did bring maybe a little more life to Granby for a while. But, ultimately, what really happened is you see these, like when they decided to build Columbia on higher ground, you see the reason is that it's unhealthy. Granby is an unhealthy place. They didn't know why. They didn't know that mosquitoes spread diseases. And if you look at the epidemics in South Carolina, it was really bad in the 1990s, yellow fever. And, the people just gradually figured out it's just not a good place to live. It's not healthy. The floods made things miserable. And really that was the end. And then also, what's happening now, the reason Granby developed there is because it's the fall line, and that's about as far upriver as you could travel in boats. And, ironically, I don't know if you call it ironic, but now today, the reason the quarry is there is for the same reason. It's an easy place to get granite. So now the quarry is destroying Granby also. And I'm just going to throw in this little thing. This is not the 18th century, but this was a little funny thing I ran across, a new related to the Civil War, and we do find items from the Civil War in our dig. Sherman himself, after the war, said that they camped in Old Granby, and he was familiar with South Carolina. He'd spent time in Charleston before the Civil War, and so he mentioned that he camped. And this article in the state newspaper in 1966, I don't know where they got this information, but it states while Sherman's men were camped in that area, Union soldiers started dropping dead with shots through the head. And they finally isolated it where the shots were coming from. They set up some cannons and blasted the area. And they went over by boat to check out what had been going on. And they found a 14-year-old boy dead next to his rifle. So it may well be that this 14-year-old killed more Union soldiers than the Confederate Army at Columbia. So I added this in just to show that the history continues. And like this 1947 article showing LCTs from the invasion of Normandy with World War II veterans manning them, and they're moving granite from the Cayce quarry down to Charleston in these boats. About 21 or 22 of these LCTs were used for that. So the history continues. And, going back here where I started, the area of the 12,000 year history park, there's this new development down here, which I think is probably could be a good thing, with the 12,000 year history park having some retail stores there for tourists when they come off to visit the 12,000 year history park. But a danger that's happening right now is over here in the quarry. The Martin Marietta I've been told they have a 75 to 150 year plan. So this is way beyond us. And they want to dig another quarry hole where the Riverland Park neighborhood is. And they've already bought up a number of houses. And they just tear down the houses, or they move them off for the person that sold the property. But they're disappearing. How can we save that? And I think, officially calling this part of the 12,000 year history park would help. Putting up historical markers would help. But, ultimately it's going to be another generation that is going to save this. And that's a little disturbing when you see the young generation now, but we got to do what we can. And again, in that area, we found Saxgotha, Fort Congaree 1, Fort Congaree 2, Granby. Lost to the quarry right now is 2/3 of Granby and Fort Granby. And that new quarry will swallow up the rest of Granby and Fort Congaree 2. And so the main website again is historysoft.com. I've got a lot of this in my book, Miracles to Yesterday, because there's a lot of miraculous things that brought me into this and led me to these places. But the main website, historysoft.com, remember that, and you can find links to many of the different projects. And I think that's the end of my presentation. JR and Andy, do you have anything else you'd want to add here at the end?
Just want to thank John Jamison with 12,000 Year History Park, and of course you, David, and JR for being a part of these presentations about the history of this area, which we think is so important, and is we want to get the word out there on the history in this area.
Okay, yeah, same here too. Thanks, John.
I want to add one more thing. I mentioned in another class that once the State House opens back up again, you can go in, and the corner, right when you walk in and you turn, the whole corner is dedicated to Emily Giger. And so you can see more information. I don't know if there's more information, but it's neat that they have her in there also.
Okay, great. Thanks.
David, I want to jump in there. I probably should have done it a little bit earlier, but on that first map for the DeSoto route, Y'all know I'm from Alabama, and my archaeology professor, McDonald Brooms, he's the former state archaeologist of Alabama. He was very active in trying to locate Mobila, which was the first major conflict in this country between Europeans and Native Americans outside of what is now Mexico. And that route going south is too far north, according to him and some of the other research done in Alabama. They think that little southern point right there on your map is actually down in Clark County, which is further south.
Mm-hmm.
It's strongly debated, and unfortunately, Mobila has not been found. There's again debate about what might have happened and research about what might have happened to the site. It's thought now, based on some current research, it may be underwater. It could have also been destroyed by agriculture or perhaps its own private property and cannot be accessed. But if it is ever discovered, it will verify exactly where that southern route is and will verify a major site of, where that battle occurred. And good reading on that is a 2-volume series, if y'all are not familiar with it, the DeSoto Chronicles. And that was published by the University of Alabama Press in 1990. And that compiles all 4 of those chronicles that you mentioned earlier. And that's very good reading, by the way.
Okay,
And
thanks, DC. Yeah, thanks. And
DeSoto,
DC is one of our main volunteers and archaeologists with the Granby Dig and Fort Congaree too. And he's very involved with the 12,000 Year History Park, I think.
So, yeah, take that. And, good presentation, David. I just wanted to kind of clarify that route is still strongly under debate and research right now. Not just that area,
Yep.
but.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I hear, I don't know if I mentioned it, but I've heard through the grapevine, there is a piece of evidence found from DeSoto here, in, not too far from Columbia, but that would be the first thing in South Carolina.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that grapevine too. So yeah, I got you. But good presentation.
Okay, thanks.
David, we have some questions from the chat. David and JR and Andy, was the Congaree River at Saxgotha easy to cross? So I would think not.
Yeah, at Saxgotha, no, I don't think so. There's, that I've seen documentation that at Fort Congaree too, there was a ford, and that's kind of difficult for me to believe when I look out there. I've never seen the river low enough for that to happen, but I don't know. There have been dams. There's a dam built up there at the locks on the Cayce Riverwalk. A lot of people think those locks are really old, but they were actually made about 1900. But the dam is still there, and I don't know what kind of effect that stuff has. But yeah, I don't think it was easy to cross at all down at Saxgotha, which is lower than Fort Congaree too.
Okay, another question. Where are the artifacts that were dug from Granby currently housed?
So I'm housing those right now, and we may be, in fact, I've talked a little bit about Andy, putting together a exhibit for the Cayce Museum. So I've talked with Jonathan Leader, the state archaeologist, and he said they can take them, put them in their warehouse, but that's the problem. It just goes in a warehouse and nobody sees them. So I'd really like it to be on display, and that'll be a big effort. I feel like we've got about another 25 good pits to do in Granby, and I'd really kind of like to get that done and then spend time putting together, a display. And we have it all on that website. All our artifacts are photographed on that website and documented.
A related question, so the artifacts are not accessible now to researchers?
We could make it we could make it available. Yeah.
Okay,
but
so
nobody's done that.
that.
You can contact me through that website. My email is on there.
Okay.
And yeah, that'd be the best way. And, in fact, I'm just starting to do some electrolysis stuff right now because I've, discovered, on some of these more interesting pieces. Most of them are just nails, but there are some interesting iron pieces, and we need to try to save those before it's too late.
David, do you have a time scale for reports that you might, additional reports you might put out on the research you're doing?
Yeah, so we did do an official site form for Granby through 100 pits, and we're now at pit 112. But I have submitted that. There's a site number for it, and Dr. Leader said himself that it was a great, huge set of information that we provided in that. But if you want to actually see and examine the artifacts, you'll have to contact me, and we'll arrange for that.
Okay. Any more questions from anyone for David or JR or Andy? If not, I would like to say we had a comment that this was an awesome presentation. I would want to say ditto to that. David, JR, and Andy. David, it's, you point out really the depth of the details of history, that some of which we don't know yet. Certainly we would find out some of these questions through archaeology, but maybe further archival research. But it's just great that we could have this exposed and get the information out, that we have this great resource in the 12,000 year park, and also nearby in what we concentrated on today, the 1 square mile within the city of Cayce. So Cayce really houses very significant resources for the history of the Midlands and South Carolina, and even nationally. So we're real happy that you helped us point that out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me and the opportunity to, 'cause that's what it's all about, is sharing it. I don't do this to make money. None of those volunteers do. We do it because we love the history.
None of us are in it for the money, but there's a invaluable way of looking at this. The information that's brought forward, ways of making the story interesting for the public and for schools. We have some classrooms, Lexington County School classrooms, that are participating in these sessions. So it's great to have that emphasized and brought out. Okay. I want to thank everybody for participating. This is our last virtual event of 2020. We hope to do more next year. We also hope to open up the park by March to in-person tours and programs, not only cultural events, but natural history events. We're going to hopefully have a few more virtual programs before we can do that, both on natural and historic resources. So please stay tuned to Cayce12000years.com for an update of that schedule. Thank you, everyone. It was a great opportunity to do this. We did record this session, which I will be posting a link. The links, I believe, will be posted on our website. But if you have questions, you want to email me at jhjameson@yahoo.com. I will be glad to send you that link once we have that established. So again, thanks everyone. Have a good day. Stay safe.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Great presentation. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Okay. Thanks, John. I just unshared.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
Really great information, and I'm sure we'll probably get some follow-up questions even from the recording. I'll let you know about that, and we can address those.
Yeah, you can forward anything to me you want.
Okay.
Any questions? Okay.
Thank you, David. It was great seeing you and great hearing about all this. Thank you.
Yeah, great work. Thanks for doing all this.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks.
So long. Bye-bye.